Guess who just celebrated an anniversary? Also, we did this game a long time ago, so we're redoing it.
Me. It's me. It's my anniversary. And I thought we'd celebrate by playing Shantae.
Kind of a blast from the past. Shantae has been, for a while now, one of, like, the mascots of the indie scene. Like, where Shovel Knight is kind of the mascot of, like, fully realized cultural icons. Shantae is kind of like the mascot of those sort of middle ground, not entirely complete, but oh so charming indie games that are just like they're great, they're memorable, but they always leave you wanting a little bit more than what you get.
Well, the original game is about as complete as it gets. In this case, it's just that this game was released at the very tail end of the Game Boy Color's lifespan.
Well, the Game Boy Advance was already out, so...
Yeah, the Game Boy Color's lifespan was pretty much kaput at this point, and this game just kind of flew under everyone's radar.
Yeah.
Nobody gave a shit.
It's what happens when you release a year later than when the next system comes out. So I remember seeing this on like Toys R Us shelves, and I kicked myself for not getting them. But 11 years old, you don't know any better. So it's just kind of like, why do I want this weird Game Boy Color game? I want the Game Boy Advance game.
I mean, they're obviously trying to compensate by making it GBA enhanced, but that's really just the same. It's the same thing at the time as it was making like certain Game Boy games enhanced by the Game Boy Color. Like nobody really cares all that much. And the Game Boy Advance was kind of a huge leap compared to going from the Game Boy to the Game Boy Color.
Yeah, it was. Like a substantial leap.
It was going from the NES to the Super Nintendo, basically.
Not even. I would say the NES to a Sega 32X that had actual good games.
To be fair to Shantae, though, the animation quality and the colors and everything, it does kind of like compete with the Game Boy Advance a little,
If we're talking like animation wise, yes. Like this is a phenomenal Game Boy Color game. Just in terms of look, sounds, and just how it operates.
I mean, they're kind of pushing the boundaries of what the hardware was capable of, and in some areas they're pulling their plays right out of the Shining series playbook from back in the day, where like they have all these like complicated hand-drawn backgrounds that you sort of rotate around in and all. It's it's charming. And you won't really find much like it on any system because, like, those those weird console game midquel entries that don't really mesh with the stuff on the console they were on, but also aren't quite as technically impressive as the stuff that followed. They have a tendency to have this really unique identity to them, where the only thing you really see when you look at that game is that specific game.
I have to wonder, though, because I don't remember if we discussed this in the previous commentary or at all during any of the other commentaries, but does anybody know exactly when and why Shantae took off eventually?
Rixie's Revenge being promoted on DSiWare, basically. Mostly because it was the only thing of real value on that service.
But it had links. But it had the links thing, the Zelda 4-player thing.
Yeah, that was one that had been done before too. I think that's the worst version of like the 4-player Zelda thing.
I hear it's okay. Like, but it's like it's really no different than the previous experience.
So it was kind of like the one thing Nintendo could point to and say, "Hey, there's this neat thing on our new download service for the DS. Please play it. Check it out." So it was like the one time. It was like one of the rare times Nintendo was kind of forced to really promote indie stuff before they started.
I can imagine like the poor kid's like, "Wow, this game is awesome. Oh, it has a Game Boy Color game. I think I can go buy it."
$300 later. I mean, thankfully the game is now significantly easier to play because it's on. It was first put on 3DS's eShop and now it's on everything. So
yeah. But being put on a 3DS was like the best thing to happen. The original Shantae.
Yeah. And then we got, Pirate's Curse, which is a phenomenal game. And then we got, the other two games, which are still very good. So
The unfortunate thing about going back to the original Shantae, though, is it's the first game in the series. So there's
A combination of first game blues where it's just, they're figuring things out, also just being on very limited hardware.
Well, I mean, the game's kind of torn between being a platformer and being a Metroidvania, which is not necessarily... They're two different design mentalities, and they don't exactly blend well. Like, this is probably the only Metroidvania-like game that I can think of from like, back then or even now that has a substantial number of instant death obstacles.
Well, there are instant death obstacles and you have lives.
Yes, and lives.
Like you don't see that in other Metroidvanias, and that is not a good thing. Sometimes being unique is not good.
Well, other Metroidvanias, for the most part, the only thing that'll kill you is the combat. And you get booted back to the title screen, or you have some sort of Dark Souls-esque checkpoint system, depending on what era you're talking about. But no, this is like a very old school life system.
Yeah, Ryan, why aren't we playing Pokemon Legends Arceus?
I'll get to it. It's next on my recording list. But it's just hard to say, considering this is a Game Boy Color game. Aside from Samus, Metroid 2 Return of Samus on regular Game Boy, I can't really think of any other Metroidvania-style games on this or Game Boy Color. So I'm sure some exist. It's just one of those, I can't really think of any, so I imagine part of the design process was, hey, we can't really go full that. People still primarily think of, Game Boy as, hop and bop platformer sort of things. So let's keep some of that in there to try to appeal to people.
Well, I mean, there is that, but also, like, that kind of hop and bop vibe is also, like, really, very, very, like, intrinsic to the attitude of Shantae, so, Yeah.
I mean, it's an interesting thing because, you go into the history of Shantae, they were Matt and Aaron Bozon were designing her, early 90s as, like, a Super Nintendo game. And all that, so the project jumped around a few different places as they were, getting the very basics of it figured out. So,
I think probably the most fascinating entry that never was the Game Boy Advance entry.
Yeah,
that would eventually mutate into Risky's Revenge.
Yeah.
I say mutate because that ensues that, like, it clearly wasn't a clean transition.
A little bit, yeah. Risky's Revenge is kind of a very weird. It's not really a 2, it's more like a 1.5 going into Pirate's Curse.
Yeah, that is clearly not finished.
Well, I mean, that's kind of the curse this series has been straining under. It's not the only series that I've played that has that problem, where they can't, for most of the games, they can't really get everything they want done. Through largely no fault of their own, but the games do end up coming out undercooked, and that's unfortunate because I'd like to play, a few more fully cooked Shantae games before I die. That would be very nice if that would happen.
Well, we got about like 20 years left, so.
I'm glad you have such an optimistic.
Okay, fine. 19, fine, you pessimist.
Okay, so... Wait, why are you...
So the weak point for this boss is the barrel in the door. It kind of blends in because it shares the same color palette as the
rest of the boat.
As the building itself, yeah. So that wasn't very obvious when I first played this.
That's the unfortunate thing about this being on the Game Boy Color. Is that, like, yeah, the colors are nice, but there are only so many of them you can have at once. So the levels do tend to get a little bit visually homogeneous at times. Like...
to a point, like, because the Game Boy Color could rock more colors than the NES.
Yeah, it could, but not as much as the SNES.
No.
Like, there's a lot of brown going on, because right now, like, so many of their environmental color slots are just being taken up by shades of brown. And,
No, there's some blue in there.
Shantae has her own separate little palette, but it's like 4 colors in total, so that's fine. But she's always going to be the thing that pops out the most because she always has her own colors. And Risky Boots is significantly less colorful than she will be in later games. She's basically got red, black, and
Gray.
White. Yeah, gray. I was like, it's not even white. It's gray.
She might.
Very zombie.
She might even be sharing her palette with that anchor. I don't know.
It doesn't translate well to like updated assets. I remember like one of the skins you can unlock for Half Genie Hero, I think it was a Kickstarter backer or at first, was that you can unlock Classic Risky, and it's just that color palette, and it looks so fucking weird. Her eyes are just completely red, as if she didn't get any sleep. And it's like, this speaks to me, but it also doesn't look very good.
Creepypasta risky.
Also, the mayor's not a Toad copy anymore in this game.
Well, shout outs to Beta Shantae in the crowd there.
Yeah.
He's just standing there in the middle. Actually, I don't know what that's going on there, but
I do like the general aesthetic of these games. One thing that I will note is that for this first game, because the graphics are so limited, the game is just kind of like almost completely confined to its sprite style, which is not something that is true of any other game after this. The other games like tend to share sprites between entries, but then have radically different art styles in their character portraits. That has a kind of an impact on the tone of the game.
It's weird because Shantae and Risky's Revenge Shantae look very similar. She's a lot more spindly, I would say, compared to that. But once Pirate's Curse came out, I think they kind of settled on more or less stable designs for everyone.
But by Pirate's Curse, it was like anime. I think we can thank what was it, Inti Crates that helped.
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
Pirate's Curse.
Well, it's kind of funny. Like, Risky's Revenge has an art style that sticks fairly close to this game's art style when it goes for the more detailed pixel art like this, or when it's in towns. But then you get to Pirate's Curse, which has a very, like, stylized anime style that really emphasizes every character's shininess and sexiness, except for Bolo, who's Bolo.
Yeah.
And then...
Who was also given a pair of breasts.
And then immediately after that, they go to an art style that's, like, pure cuteness for everyone.
Well, I think after Pirate's Curse, Half Genie Hero and Seven Sirens was just trying to emulate Pirate's Curse art style because of just how successful and popular Pirate's Curse ended
Seven
up being.
Sirens is a bit weird because it keeps the cutesy art style for all of the in-game sprites, but then it has this really like high energy anime style for certain FMVs and
well, I mean that's what happens when you reuse the engine of Half Genie Hero for the gameplay and then have a completely different art style.
It just kind of like feels like they don't know how to unify their visuals, so they don't have the budget to redo enough of them to unify them when they.
Which I don't think is going to be a thing until the game goes full 2.5D, which I'm kind of hoping doesn't happen because I really admire Shantae's commitment to the sprites and just high definition. 2D.
I mean, I'm also very curious as to if they ever go the full 3D route.
Now, I like these kind of like rotating sprite art towns. The only other game that I can think of off the top of my head that uses this, and I mentioned Shining series, is Shining in the Darkness, which is an absolutely brutal first-person dungeon crawler labyrinth game, and it's good if you like that sort of thing. I don't, but I always found the towns striking. They put a lot of work into them. Not entirely so here, because whenever you go into a building, you transition into this kind of Zelda 2 side-scrolling room with just a person in it. I think this would have been more effective if they had gone full Shining in the Darkness and made all the buildings their own little pixel art paintings with all the NPCs in the background doing their thing. But that's just hindsight, I guess.
So that you're transitioning to different Hollywood backdrops, essentially.
Yeah. Well, Shining in the Darkness has the benefit of being on the Genesis, so. But like,
yeah.
It does the same sort of rotating landscape in town, and when you go into like the tavern, you get a big detailed picture of the tavern with all of the characters sitting at the tavern, talking to each other, doing whatever. And you can highlight them, and they'll look at you when you highlight them, and that sort of thing. Whereas this sort of goes back and forth, and doesn't really... Like, Shantae here is very detailed in this, like, sprite from behind where she runs in, but then you see the NPCs walking around in the mid background, and they're just the same sprites that you'd see in a side scroller section. So it doesn't entirely mesh, you know.
I think it's one of those where, you know, like in 3D games, like the farther you away, the more polygons you lose. It's that, but it's in 2D.
Well, Shantae doesn't seem to suffer from that because as she runs into the door, she becomes distant, but she's still really detailed, you know.
Main character powers.
Yeah, she's main character priority. Literally saps the pixels away from other characters.
I forgot what it was like to play a Game Boy game that was actually written in English first, and the sentences make sense and aren't crammed down to as few words as possible. It was like so many of the Game Boy games I played back in the day were written in Japanese first, and the dialogue really suffers for that because they really do not have room for translations.